If by Asia we mean the broader continent, which includes the Middle East, Central Asia, Russia, places like Iran, the Caucasus, then this recent pivot to Asia is not a new phenomenon. It has a history that goes back to the end of the Cold War, since when Turkey has been cultivating strong cultural and commercial ties with all these regions that I mentioned. And perhaps for the lack of a better term, we can gather these different regions under the umbrella term West Asia. So when we speak of Turkey's relationship with Asia, in the first instance, we should think of this West Asian geography, which is the more immediate environment that Turkey has. But it's also true that in light of what is going on with Germany and the broader crisis with the EU, and also with the US as well, Turkey has had problems with the US, especially because of divergent interests in Syria, and also the US has been accommodating the number one enemy of Erdogan, Fethullah Gülen, the leader of the religious community that is, who is held responsible for the recent coup attempt. So for all these reasons, a lot of individuals among the pro-Erdogan intellectual and media circles are evoking this idea of pivoting towards Asia. But what they mean is it goes beyond, this evocation goes beyond these historical ties to the Western Asian geography. It mostly concerns a geopolitical reorientation toward Russia and China. Being part of Asia or having strong relations with Asian countries doesn't entail that, doesn't require the ruling elites to pass in a reform agenda or to adopt certain policies or to uphold rule of law and so on. As we see in the case of Chinese foreign policy, a lot of foreign ties and foreign trade transpires without China pressuring any of the governments to adopt certain policies at home. So this hands-off, mostly a hands-off approach to domestic issues is very liberating from the perspective of Erdogan, which has recently come under pressure for because of the recent clampdown on dissent and so on. Currently, it's not very tangible, partly because all these countries that Turkey has a crisis with currently are also its main trading partners. So Germany comes first on the top of the list when it comes to Turkish exports. After that comes the UK and Italy and the US and so on. So most of this evocation of pivot to Asia is discursive, really, because apart from Chinese imports to Turkey, there is no substantial trade between Turkey and the rest of basically East Asia, because Turkey has trade with Russia, Iran, Iraq quite a bit, but that doesn't necessarily extend into other parts of Asia. So for that sort of pivot to work in the long run, we need to see more trade between Turkey and Asia, slowly replacing Turkey's economic ties with the West. Potentially, already China comes on the top of the list when it comes to Turkish imports. Turkey imports a quarter of its goods from China. So that's very substantial, but that's one way. So it's a very unbalanced trade. And for this One Road, One Belt project to be beneficial for Turkey, a lot of projects that are currently on paper or being developed between China and Europe have to transpire first, and all these pipelines and highways go through a lot of problematic areas, starting from Central Asia into the Caucasus and Iran, passing through the Middle East into Europe. So China has to solve a lot of problems for these projects to be successful in the first place. And then maybe in the long run, we will see the long-term benefits of that, of this infrastructure venture. I think Erdogan has been vocal about Muslim plight, let's say in general, whether it was in Palestine or in Myanmar and so on. I think very little of it has to do with a very conscious turn to Asia. I think a lot of it has to do with his own public image in Turkey. So that definitely works for him. Every time he does that, every time he becomes very vocal about these international issues. It also raises his standing among Muslim populations across the Middle East and beyond. But this cannot be the basis on which Erdogan pivots to Asia, or that he attracts the leadership, any leadership in Asian countries. When we think of Turkey's history, Turkey's future lies with the Middle East and Eastern Europe, actually, because if you think of Turkey as the inheritor of the Ottoman Empire, the proper historical basis for its future lies with Eastern Europe and the Middle East. But Turkey also had turned east quite a number of times in its history, particularly over the course of the 20th century. One of these episodes came after the First World War, when, upon increasing encroachment by European powers, certain intellectuals and pashas were in search of new lands to build an alternative space for Turkish Muslims. But more substantially, if we remember the end of the Cold War, when the collapse of the Soviet Union threw out into the open millions of former Soviet citizens who were nominally Muslim, this gave a reason for Turkish Muslim businessmen and Turkish Muslim activists to cross the borders and bring these ethnic brethren into the fold of global capitalism on the one hand, and also into the fold of Islam. So by doing so, they were undoing the evils of a communist and an atheist regime, so to speak. And so a pivot to Asia in that way is not completely foreign to the Turkish public, Turkish business circles, and the Turkish leadership. But it is mostly focused on West Asia and Central Asia through the bridge of the Caucasus. And it only works when there is substantial business interest and business ties, which was established in the wake of the end of the Cold War, basically. But we don't see that sort of commercial space opening up anytime soon between Turkey and certainly not with East Asia. If this pivot to Asia, particularly in terms of geopolitics, becomes substantial in the near future, then this will basically affect the opposition parties and oppositional figures in Turkey, which will have less space to negotiate and less space to, for example, lobby Western circles, certainly vis-a-vis Erdogan, to force Erdogan from without to make some compromises. So a lot of dissident circles in Turkey have that space in Germany currently. Germany historically has been harboring Turks who went there either as leftists in the 1980s or a lot of Kurds in the 1990s. And it has always been a thorn in Turkish-German relationship. So if Turkey was to turn to Asia in any substantial way, and if this was to be followed by a Turkish-Asian trade replacing Turkish-German and Turkish-European trade, then that oppositional space within Turkey would certainly shrink. And that would obviously that is an advantage for Erdogan, but we are yet to see.